Welcome to Voice Over Work, an audiobook sampler. Where do you listen? I'm Russell, founder of Newton Media Group, and today is August 16th, 2022. Today we present the chapter-by-chapter preview of Albert Rutherford's book, International Relations, for People Who Hate Politics. This book presents the historical and theoretical milestones that have shaped modern global politics and thus the world. It highlights the biggest turning points in history, the most influential schools of thought which impact political decision-making to this day. This book will provide you with the context that the news often omit, what ideas influence and impact leaders' decision-making in the background, and how these ideas provide strengths and expose vulnerabilities. Thanks for joining us today, and here's the preview of Albert Rutherford's International Relations. Part 1. Foundations of International Relations. Historical background, theoretical background. Historical background, Chapter 1. Greece and the work of Thucydides. Thucydides was among the first Western historians to chronicle a major conflict using scientific standards of impartiality. He wrote a historical account of the Peloponnesian War through evidence gathering and cause and effect analysis, a revolutionary feat at a time when crowd-pleasing stories involving religious explanations for events were the norm. Instead, Thucydides analyzed the human factors and motivations that led to and amplified the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that occurred during his lifetime. The Peloponnesian War was fought between the Delian League, led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, from 431 to 404 BC. When writing history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides relied on interpretations of chronological facts. He primarily employed eyewitness accounts, evaluations of sources, and his own experience to recount the events leading to the breakout of the war and the ones that followed. The first book sought to explain the reasons behind the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, and books 2 through 8 focused on the war itself. Throughout the book, Thucydides utilized analyses of human factors and motivations driving the war. In the first book, Thucydides argued the Spartans were compelled to war, suggesting they had no choice but to combat Athens' rising power. To support his claim, he laid out the perceived causes of the war, focusing primarily on economic and conflicting political power struggles as the leading causes. The Delian League, which started as a small group of city-states following the end of the Persian Wars, was developing into a significant power in the Mediterranean region decades before the Peloponnesian War. As Athens grew stronger, it began to dominate other city-states, subjugating them to tribute-paying subject states to the Delian League. Part of the Peloponnesian League, Sparta, was particularly fearful of Athens' growing influence in the ancient Greek world. Several events played a role in increasing tensions, including, but not limited to, Sparta dismissing the Athenian force after summoning it to help suppress a rebellion on Spartan territory. While Athens and Sparta fought together against the Persians from 492 to 449 BC, Athens renounced its alliance with Sparta during the Helot Revolt. During that time, Greek city-states placed far more emphasis on local loyalties than on their shared cultural heritage. Nevertheless, the cultural considerations within Thucydides' writings were paramount because they explained how alliance politics played an essential role in the outbreak of the war. Alliances moved from being formed to counterattacks on a large part of the ancient Greek world to being founded based on regional fidelities. It was only a matter of time until the Delian and Peloponnesian Leagues collided. The Delian League's power was augmented by its naval superiority, used to intimidate allies. The Peloponnesian League, headed by Sparta, grew increasingly concerned about Athens' ability to dominate the seas. Sparta and Athens supervised different spheres of influence, but Sparta regarded Athens' rapid rise as an empire as a great threat to the traditional balance of power. By maintaining that war is likely, if not inevitable, when a rising power can... Chapter 2, Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia followed one of the longest and most devastating conflicts in modern history. The culmination of clashes between Protestants and Catholics over the authority of the Catholic Church, coupled with European power politics at the time, resulted in a series of wars fought mainly in Central Europe between 1618 and 1648, known as the 30 Years' War. During the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation divided the Holy Roman Empire. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg attempted to settle the conflicts resulting from the religious divide by allowing rulers to choose between Roman Catholicism or Lutheranism in their respective territories. However, the many Calvinist rulers and their citizens were not recognized, resulting in tensions that caused Catholic and Protestant states to form alliances. Ferdinand II was a devout Catholic who took power in 1617 as the King of Bohemia, today a territory of the Czech Republic, and then as the Holy Roman Emperor. Soon after rising to power, Ferdinand II revoked Emperor Rudolf II's 1609 Letter of Majesty, granting Protestants religious tolerance in Bohemia. A civil war erupted in 1618 between German members of the Holy Roman Empire in response to Ferdinand II's decision to revoke religious tolerance in Bohemia. Protestants attacked Ferdinand II's palace, throwing 2 of his ministers out a window and forcing the Catholic king out. But the 30 Years' War was not only caused by religious struggles. Foreign powers also had a vested interest in these developments. France, Sweden, Denmark, and England offered their support to the Protestant princes of Germany fighting the Catholic Habsburgs, later backed by Spain. The 30 Years' War had a profound impact on Europe's political and social landscape, claiming the lives of 4 to 12 million people and diminishing Europe's total population by an estimated 20%. The Holy Roman Empire alone lost about a third of its population. The 30 Years' War was finally ended with a series of peace treaties, namely the Treaty of Osnabrück and the Treaty of Münster, signed in 1648. Negotiations started in 1642 with diplomatic representatives from 96 separate entities meeting in the cities of Osnabrück and Münster, although some scholars argue that comprehensive negotiations that truly intended to stop wars did not begin until 1945, with the ratification of the Charter of the United Nations. Intense devastation and the immense loss of life forced the concerned parties, each with their own set of goals, to the negotiation table. The peace settlement led to several territorial adjustments, including, but not limited to, the independence of the United Provinces from the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, Dutch independence from Spain, and Swedish control over the Baltic. The heritage of Westphalia. The immediate impact of this historic settlement cannot be overlooked, as it involved a concerted international diplomatic effort at a level not seen before that time that established the concept of diplomacy and negotiation. This effort led to the formal recognition of freedom of conscience, and it solidified the foundation of religious tolerance in granting Catholics and Protestants the freedom to practice. Chapter 3, Impact of World War I on the Study of International Relations. World War I marked the first time the world was truly embroiled in a conflict that spanned continents. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was the immediate cause of the Great War, but appropriating its origin to one single moment in history is counterfactual and unproductive. The fundamental source of World War I is complex, involving the actions of numerous nations. Some scholars have primarily blamed Germany by arguing it had secret ambitions to annex a large part of Europe. Others have claimed Germany failed to put pressure on its ally, Austria-Hungary, to stop the outbreak of the war, and some scholars even credit Great Britain for escalating the war by getting involved. The causes of the Great War can be traced back to the late 1800s, when Europe became increasingly polarized through various realignments and alliance formations. World War I is considered by many to be one of the most important political events in history because of its remarkable impact on the modern global system. For perhaps the first time in history, the Great War's profound human costs prompted a cohesive global pursuit to make sense of the driving forces behind the war to evade future conflicts. Over 16 million people died, and the war wiped away an entire generation of men. The immediate aftermath of World War I saw new developments arise across various fields and industries. World War I changed the nature of warfare, with technological advancements taking center stage in conflicts that followed. It reconstructed Europe's class structure by speeding up the decline of the upper class through greater political representation for the masses. Social and political changes brought about by the war democratized international political theory and discourse. Greater openness was fostered by scrutiny of the elite's ability to resolve conflicts peacefully, which faltered in the war's run-up. The notion that an enlightened and well-informed public was a prerequisite to global peace gained traction, and the establishment of world affairs councils, international relations curricula, and schools of thought soon followed. The realization that an educated, peace-seeking populace could help prevent major conflicts compelled nations to look inward. The paradox of the United States sending 200,000 black soldiers to Europe during World War I to fight for freedom and democracy during the segregationist Jim Crow era prompted the formation of new campaigns and organizations that actively fought discrimination as a means to elevate the positions of underrepresented citizens. In other areas of the world, the dissolution of empires paved the way for nationalism and self-determination. For example, in the Middle East, European powers extended colonial rule over the region following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So, while World War I encouraged freedom movements for underrepresented and oppressed populations in America, these movements became inherently nationalistic in the Middle East. Thus, questions rose surrounding how democratic institutions, based on mutual norms, could succeed globally when the war triggered different social changes among countries. In World War I and IR theory, Professor Pfalzgraf credits Chapter 4, The Cold War and International Relations. World War II transformed the once allied United States and the Soviet Union into world powers. Ideological differences and political rivalry between the two superpowers would mark the beginning of the Cold War, a conflict that lasted more than 4 decades. Because World War II had a devastating impact on the European continent, American President Truman devised the Marshall Plan to aid Europe's economic and social recovery. Enacted in 1948, the Marshall Plan provided more than $15 billion in aid to help rebuild Western Europe. The Soviet Union saw the Marshall Plan as an American tool for intervening in countries' domestic affairs, thus choosing not to join the plan and further propelling the two powers into chilling tensions. The Soviet Union had some valid reasons for distrusting the United States. President Truman had taken a hard-line stance against Stalin, and Western politicians employed anti-communist hysteria to amplify their influence. The CIA further aided Western interests by reportedly supporting anti-communist uprisings in places like Ukraine. Mistrust and the Soviet Union's refusal to participate in the Marshall Plan established competing spheres of influence which set the stage for the Cold War. With U.S.-Soviet relations at an all-time low, American officials adopted a policy of containment against the Soviet threat. The policy was aimed at containing a Soviet expansion of socialist influence and power. To restrain the Soviet Union's sphere of influence, the United States supported corrupt, anti-democratic governments that were friendly to America, and the Soviet Union responded by subsidizing groups that were favorable to their own global interests. America's policy of containment, however, provided a rationale for an arms buildup that was met with a Soviet response in kind. Both powers pursued the development of sophisticated weaponry and nuclear weapons, but they withheld from using them. Instead, the United States and the Soviet Union chose to assert their power by using countries who did not possess weapons of mass destruction to engage in proxy wars. Cold War-era proxy wars. Before the Cold War, most Third World countries were under colonial control, and freedom movements prompted a need for financial and military aid. America and the Soviet Union capitalized on the emergence of new states by funding and supporting ideological allies. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union indirectly engaged in numerous armed conflicts, with more notable ones being the Korean War and Vietnam War. The Korean War, for example, was perpetuated by Soviet support for North Korea and American support for South Korea. A similar trend can be seen in the Vietnam War, where American President Kennedy approved a military campaign to aid Vietnam's nationalist government because he was convinced the Soviet Union was aiding the northern communists militarily and financially. Realizing they had to garner support from Third World governments to maintain and expand their influence, the United States and the Soviet Union began supporting insurgent groups to undermine unsupportive governments. America supported anti-communist factions in countries such as Angola, Namibia, and Nicaragua. Part 2. Theoretical background. Realism, Liberalism, Constructivism, Marxism, Feminism. Zoe's story. When I chose to study IR, I didn't suspect the intricate journey of jargon the field had in store for me. My professor, Dr. Ann S., loved her jargon, so much so that in the first 3 classes I didn't even understand the questions she was asking. She was a big proponent of rationalism, the belief that opinions and theories should be based on reason and knowledge. Therefore, talking about scientific realism in her first class sounded like a good idea for her. This description I found at Stanford University's website is eerily close to how she sounded. Scientific realism is a positive, epistemic attitude toward the content of our best theories and models, recommending belief in both observable and unobservable aspects of the world described by the sciences. This epistemic attitude has important metaphysical and semantic dimensions, and these various commitments are contested by a number of rival epistemologies of science, known collectively as forms of scientific anti-realism. Now, if you're a well-versed IR professional, the paragraph above is easy to understand, but for a wide-eyed freshman, she might as well have spoken in Zulu. I took some grinding work after classes to simplify the heavily jargon-packed text to something I could understand and follow. Once I had a solid foundation in the expressions, schools of thoughts, and their significance, it was much easier to keep up with the class. The following 5 chapters will present the 5 dominant schools of thought in international relations, realism, liberalism, constructivism, Marxism, and feminism. Each of these theories evolved over time, attempting to explain the intentions, motivations, and actions of states and later non-state actors. I attempted to make the learning curve about these theories as painless and easy to follow as possible. While you learn about the 5 major IR theories, try to be mindful of your reactions. Which of them makes the most sense to you, and which of them makes you raise a brow? In other words, try to find which school of thought would represent your way of thinking about the world the best. If you wish, share your discoveries with me, either in the form of a review or shoot me an email to zoemckey@gmail.com. Which IR theory is the closest to your heart and mind? Why? Chapter 5, Realism. In academia, realism is a school of thought that focuses on intentional politics, confrontational, anarchic aspects. Realists consider sovereign states the main actors of IR. States are unitary actors that behave rationally and are led by their individual national interest. The ultimate goal for them is security and survival. Each state's strength and power dynamic establish their relations with other states. Historical roots. We can find the roots of realism in the ancient writings of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Remember, we learned extensively about his work in Chapter 1. The war was dated between 431 and 404 BC. In his work, Thucydides searches for the reasons for the Peloponnesian War. He demonstrates how Sparta's negligence of state security and Athens' assertive foreign policy paved the way for authoritarian tendencies in Greece. The Melian dialogue is an essential part of the war. After invading Melos, Athens proposed to capitulate, but the Council of Melos repudiated the demand. Although emphasizing the relations between the island of Melos and Athens, Thucydides did not consider the specific events to be the cause of the war. He argues the cause of the war was the shift of power balance between the two rival camps. Thus, Athens and Sparta were the leaders of the antagonist sides. One may say this dialogue is the first argument between realist and idealist views. The Athenian position was based on realist ideas, as they were talking from the position of power, offering Melos a choice of giving up or annihilation. Melians, on the contrary, wanted justice and suggested neutrality because they thought the gods would back their just cause and their ally, Sparta, would send them military aid. Thus, their worldview is liberal and idealist. In their view, nations have the right to enjoy sovereignty, and war, if unprovoked, is unfair. We already know how that story went down. Athens said, "Nope, we gave you a chance to resign, and since you didn't, we'll occupy you because we can." The Indian scholar Chanakya wrote on the subject of states' power-seeking behavior not long after Thucydides. He argued that any king must prioritize the power of the state as the primary goal. In doing so, annihilating the enemies that are trying to undermine this attempt is essential. However, he also advocated for rationality and not sacrificing everything for power. Well, if you ask any rational person, it makes a lot of sense. Despite their early writings, Thucydides and Chanakya were not realists. The concept of realism and IR theory didn't exist in their time, or explicitly any time until the 20th century. However, comparing the rationale and actions of some actors from the ancient world and the modern world, interesting parallels and similarities can be observed. Building upon the repetitive nature of history throughout the centuries, scholars created the theory of realism as an evergreen explanation to human political behavior. Realism during the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment. Why was realism able to survive and thrive for so long? The fundamentals of this theory are based on the intrinsic human desire for... Chapter 6, Liberalism. Liberalism has evolved as an advocate for democracy, human rights, free and fair elections, and the rule of law. It's a progressive and idealistic school of thought. Within the realm of international relations, liberalism points out the importance of state sovereignty, institutions, a free market system, national self-determination, peaceful conflict resolution, and cooperation between state and non-state actors, and spreads optimism for the future of humanity. States are a part of domestic and international civil societies, and this limits what states can and can't do. Liberalism portrays the government as an entity that must ensure not only security, but also the right of an individual to life, property, and liberty. State oppression is a serious concern for liberal scholars, as they are looking for ways to limit the political and military power of the state. For them, the military expansion of a country is as concerning as domestic oppression. But isn't a militarily strong state a better place to live? No. Liberal authors are against allocating resources to maintain foreign lands under occupation. That's why they came up with the idea of free and fair elections and division of the government into different branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Historical roots. Unlike realism, the roots of which are traced to Thucydides, liberalism is the product of the 17th century's Enlightenment movement that questioned excessive state regulation over individual rights and liberty. This period is characterized by fundamental changes in European societies and transformation from feudalism to capitalism. The zeitgeist of the era groomed a legion of thinkers who spread the ideas of a free market and individual freedom. The center of the work of early liberals was freeing individuals from the two forms of contemporary social constraint: religious conformity and aristocratic privilege. The state and government powers were responsible for perpetuating and enforcing these limitations to individual freedom. The goal of the early liberals was to limit the power of government over individuals and, simultaneously, hold it accountable to the people. John Locke was the scholar who laid the foundations of liberalism. His idea of a social contract is working to this day. Individuals are surrendering some of their rights to the state in exchange for protection of the right to life, freedom, and property. An individual has complete sovereignty over their rights, but the state is the authority that protects those rights. Locke's theory of natural law serves as a basis for liberalism, where human rights, private property, and the redistribution of wealth are paramount to ensure everyone's interests, including the poorest. Jeremy Bentham, another prominent liberal scholar, argued human beings are looking for pleasure and avoiding pain, so the political system should help achieve the greatest amount of happiness or to maximize utility. His theory is called utilitarianism. On the international level, Bentham was an advocate for the creation of international courts to resolve disputes among the states. We can observe the fruits of his ideas today in the International Court of Justice. Like other major theories, liberalism was changing through time. Classical liberalism was not the same as liberalism before and after World Wars I and II. In the following sections, we'll explore the development of liberalism, not only as a theory, but also as a practical point of view. Classical liberalism. Peace is the cornerstone of liberalism, and democratic peace theory illustrates this. Democratic peace. Chapter 7. Constructivism. Constructivism is a theory of international relations that has challenged the established understanding of the world. If you're looking for a worldview that's not afraid of going against dogmatic approaches, constructivism is for you. By discussing the intricacies of constructivism, we're entering the post-Cold War era. Constructivism is born because traditional theories, such as liberalism and realism, cannot give a credible answer to the question of why the hostilities between the United States and the USSR have ended so abruptly. There was no major war that brought an end to the bipolar world order, no anarchy, as realism predicted. The bipolar world didn't persist, as neo-realism thought. Looking at the world as the state or the international environment as the main driver of dynamic traditional theories have spent much time observing the agency of individuals. Constructivism argues people are shaping the social world. Influential individuals and ordinary citizens are the main actors in international relations, which, by its nature, is socially constructed. Let's take Alexander Wendt's illustrative example as proof of the social construction of reality. He said the U.S. feels less threatened by 500 British nuclear weapons than 5 North Korean ones. It's not the weapons, material structure, that causes the distress, but the meaning behind the material structure, the ideational structure, the hostile relationship between the U.S. and North Korea. Scholars of the constructivist school focus on notions like identity and interest. Actors in international relations have a unique identity that shows their interest. The identity of small and large countries differ. Small countries would most likely be preoccupied with assuring their survival, whilst large countries with exercising their power. However, constructivists understand some states might not act according to their identity. This view explains German foreign policy. Despite being the largest economy in Europe, they're not pursuing military expansion. Their World War II history also weighs in this choice. To demonstrate that the constructivist approach applies to the real world, let's analyze the example of Bhutan. This small country in the Himalayas is situated between two regional leaders, China and India. Realists would say Bhutan is vulnerable, especially because of the assertive foreign policy of China in Tibet. However, from the constructivist point of view, Bhutan closed its border with China and improved relations with India, thus showing the small state can have a more flexible foreign policy. Unlike realism and liberalism, which understand the world through power and institutions, constructivism enriched those visions by providing a more resilient understanding of international politics. Constructivists emphasize the importance of norms and values in international politics. They argue values, ideas, and beliefs can shape global politics. States have certain identities that constitute interests and actions. Once a state pledges to have a certain identity, it's expected to behave in accordance with the norms represented by that identity. We can see this playing out in the case of many states that have developed climate change mitigation policies. Authors identify three types of norms: regulative, constitutive, and prescriptive. The first is responsible for order. Chapter 8, Marxism. International relations incorporates various theories that offer their views on the world. So far, we've learned about realism, liberalism, and constructivism. There is one IR theory that is both a critical approach, as it questions the mainstream theories, and a philosophical approach, as it is attached to one of the most renowned German philosophers. That's right, it is Marxism. This theory offers a look into a different reality of the international system in which we live. Even though Marx's ideas are not focused on the establishments of states and their relations, the Industrial Revolution connects them to IR. Now, before I move on to talk about what Marxism is in international relations, I would like to address a common confusion people have when it comes to Marxism, socialism, and communism. Some folks use these philosophies interchangeably. However, they are not the same thing. Let's explore what's what and what is not. 1. Marxism. Both communism and socialism are rooted in Marxism. The latter provides the theoretical framework for the political and economic ideas of socialism and communism. Marxism was born in the late 1800s when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels formulated a passionate critique against the blossoming capitalism. The Industrial Revolution exacerbated the gap between social classes. The rich got way richer than ever before, while the poor worked in unregulated, inhumane conditions. Anyone who had slavery ancestry, or at the time was still a slave, would have thrown an arm up thinking, yes, we're also working in unregulated, inhuman, and worse, unpaid circumstances. They would have been right to say so. The difference that triggered some thinkers, like Marx and Engels, into cognitive action was that factories and other industrial establishments were mostly filled with non-slave, white-skinned European people, even children, and their exploitation was unacceptable. Along came Marxism. Marx observed that the working class sold their labor as a commodity to the capitalist system that created a surplus for the capitalist owner, but not for the laborer. This discrepancy, Marx predicted, would inherently lead to resentment and conflict between the proletariat, or working class, and the bourgeoisie, or the ownership class. As capitalism is grounded in inequality, the working class would eventually revolt against the rich, fundamentally reshaping society, overthrowing capitalism, and establishing a socialist form of government. Marx envisioned this transition happening in stages. 2. Socialism. The first stage of the Marxian overtaking was socialism. This philosophy envisions public ownership of natural resources and property instead of a private one. The socialist governing style relies on market cooperation rather than competitiveness. Socialism states that as every citizen in society contributes to the production of common goods and services, these goods should be shared equally. This is where capitalists would slam the table and say, "How is this fair? Why should someone who works hard share the fruits of their hard labor with a work-shy parasite?" Well, thank you for pointing that out. Did you know socialist? Chapter 9, Feminism. So far we've covered traditional theories of international relations, such as realism and liberalism, and talked about critical theories like constructivism and Marxism. In this chapter, we're going to learn about one of the most recent theories, feminism. International relations is constantly trying to be on foot with modern global politics and understand how the world operates, and feminism contributes with a thus far unexplored angle: how women have been absent and marginalized in politics and decision-making throughout the centuries. IR has constantly been under criticism for being gender blind. Feminist scholars have challenged these basic concepts and assumptions of international relations, deconstructing gender both as a socially constructed identity and an organizing idea. This meant first acknowledging and then challenging the roles men and women hold in global politics. Thanks to feminism, these roles are slowly changing as public attention has been turned to the inequalities women have in representation, payment, and possibilities. The journey involved uncovering the issue of gendered violence. Making violence against women visible in global politics was essential and was a successful hit against existing assumptions of the international system that neglected the impact these events had on the everyday life of women. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has launched a campaign to end violence against women. This is a global issue, and over 600 million women live in regions and countries where domestic violence is rampant and its impact is neglected. Some of these countries present themselves as safe, peaceful, and democratic. In general, women do not have as many political, economic, and social rights and power as men do. The feminist approach challenges an established perception of the security agenda that is proposed by traditional theories and schools of thought in IR. Feminism argues the exclusive nature of gender politics is obvious. For example, even though women are more likely to populate the areas where security is an issue and conflicts are rampant, gendered exclusion is highly present. Feminist scholars, therefore, are demonstrating the need for inclusive politics that emphasizes and allows the contribution of women in politics. One of the central goals of feminism is to transform international politics to be more inclusive. Institutions and decision-making positions are not represented equally. They're dominated by men. For instance, the national parliaments worldwide were represented by women in only 22.9% of cases, according to the World Bank's statistics in 2015. According to some major 2022 studies, despite women representing 54.3% of the U.S. workforce, only 35% are in senior leadership positions, and only 8.2% are Fortune 500 CEOs. The numbers are improving compared to past decades, but women are still underrepresented in world-leading positions. These numbers look dire if we check the statistics of less developed countries or the situation of women of color. We need to distinguish between sex and gender. The former is about human physiology, while the latter is a social construct. The feminine side of any issue is perceived as less relevant, irrational, or something that needs protection. These types of social constructs make it extremely challenging for women to access the streams of power and thus influence global politics. Over time, feminism has fought for women's rights, gender equality, women's right to vote, work, earn. This has been International Relations for People Who Hate Politics, an introduction to the causes of conflict and cooperation between states. Written by Albert Rutherford, Zoe McKey. Narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2022 by Albert Rutherford. Production copyright by Albert Rutherford. Oh, those sleazy politicians. Which is the only mammal that can thrive without a backbone? A politician. How can you spot a politician lying? Their mouth is moving. Have you ever encountered any of these remarks or jokes during your lifetime? If you live on planet Earth, you probably have. Disdain for politicians is just as common as for the parking enforcers. Politicians represent not only a country, a county, or a smaller community. They also represent the art of politics. In the minds of many, politics and politicians became synonyms. But is it prudent to judge a field of science based on some of its representatives? For instance, if you encountered a bad doctor, would it mean that medical science itself is useless? But what if all doctors were bad? Would theoretical medicine matter if all its practitioners did a poor job? One might ask. That's a tricky question. And if this was true, if all medical professionals were as good as dart-throwing monkeys, then sure, theoretical medicine wouldn't serve us much. But that's an extreme statement, and an incorrect one. By the same token, not all politicians are sleazy, lying, backbone-lacking individuals. I would go as far as to say most of them are not. If you're reading this book, there's a high chance you live in a country with democratic values. One of these values is the privilege to vote. Each citizen, therefore, who can legally vote, is a shaper of their country's politics. Ordinary citizens don't need to be politicians by profession to contribute meaningfully. Sticking to the medical analogy, not all patients have to be doctors, but knowing the basics of how the body works, how certain types of foods, a lack of exercise and sleep, stress affect them, will make them make better choices and be healthier individuals. Magnify this to the nation level, and you get a healthier, more mindful, and prosperous society. Similarly, knowing the basics of political science will help voters make better, more informed decisions. Spread this thought to the state level, and you get a more educated and intentional society. Politicians are not rotten because politics are derived from the devil. It's the other way around. Partially, society breeds people with values that are not always focused on the common good, and partially, it's human nature to take as much as one can until hitting a socially imposed barrier. If some individuals behave in dislikable ways, it's because, at the end of the day, they can. It's not the fault of the individual. The problem lies within the system. Well, let's just change the system then, one might think. Agreed. But by their nature, systems are slow and hard to change. A system is an abstract concept, the result of elements interacting with one another in pursuit of a purpose. In our case, the political system, at its most basic level, is comprised of a country's citizens who interact a certain way. A meaningful change to the system has to start with a shift in the mindset of its smallest components, the everyday folk, you and me. The first step is to separate political science as a field of study from its demonized earthly representatives. Hating politics and digging one's head in the sand, avoiding voting, or voting for whoever offers a bigger hot dog during the campaign period is... Thanks for listening to Voice Over Work, an audiobook sampler. Where do you listen? If you like what you just heard, hope you'll pass along our web address, newtonmg.com, to your friends and colleagues. This has been a Newton Media Group production. Join us again this Saturday for the next episode of Voice Over Work.